All right. What happened to the power weapon?
You want to know something we all have in common?
Yes.
Missing. We all run into it at one point. Some missed loved ones, some days gone by,
Mm-hmm.
some simply missed the last train home. For me, it's these. The S2AM sniper, the
Oh,
railgun, and who could forget the rocket launcher. Power weapons
yeah.
are missing. Looking at most FPS titles in the 90s and early 2000s, you can find them everywhere. Objects of such strength that any multiplayer match revolved around the control of it. But one day, they seemingly disappeared, without even a whisper.
Yeah.
People today indulge in battle royales and tactical FPS without even questioning where they went. Hell, some people don't even know they were there. But for me, that's not good enough. Me and these weapons has something good going. Something the modern FPS can't fill. I'm not satisfied to just move on. I need closure. I need to know what happened to the power weapon.
Oh no. No, dude, for like the most part, they're still there. Halo still has power weapons. Like the, the same like metagame of trying to race up to the power weapons is still there. At least I think in Halo. And then what else did you say? Quake? I mean, Quake has the same thing. Rocket launcher, railgun, lightning gun. Those weapons are still there with all the resources around to like run around and get them. And I mean, as far as like Counter Strike and Val go, like power weapons are there. You just can't buy them like right away. They're the most expensive guns, right? The op or whatever, the sniper in those games. They're like some of the most expensive guns. So they're still there.
It all started in 1992 with the release of Wolfenstein, a simple game, storming through a castle to rid the world of a regime that parts of America still can't come to a modern.
Holy shit! Did this game? This is Doom, but I didn't actually realize that Doom had like pictures of fucking Hitler in there with like the Nazi symbol. That's fucking crazy, dude.
Consensus on. In that castle, you'll find a splattering of different enemy types, and alongside it, 3 different weapons, each being progressively more powerful than the last. In this early landscape, these were all functionally identical tools for the trade, the small distinction being that each fired faster than the last, but despite that simplicity, it was the glue that held together the barren hallways. With chain gun in hand, you felt powerful. Whatever was
Yeah.
beyond the corner was at the mercy of your strength, but with the pistol, you felt frail, the unknowable danger that awaited you commanding caution. The ability for the game to both redact and provide you with strength created an emotional ebb and flow, creating for cathartic bursts of brutality and tense traversal as you scoured the halls eager to find the weapon to give you power. It might not have been complex, but it was the groundwork for a little game that I'm sure you've heard about. While Doom certainly popularized the FPS for home computers in the 90s, Doom itself was an offshoot from the ideas Wolfenstein put forward,
Oh,
and with
okay.
it
That was
came the
Wolfenstein
next
before.
move forward for power weapons. It still has some elements of linear progression, but it also introduces more weapons of varying qualities, giving different weapons strengths, weaknesses, and roles.
Right.
Shotguns are good up close, chain guns help you sustain, and the rocket launcher? Well, the rocket launcher was good at just about everything. Through the campaign, this created the same ebb and flow as before, but Doom introduced something that would let these weapons shine differently.
Multiplayer. So when you talk about weapon progression, um, it's gonna be really dependent on what FPS you're talking about. Um, Something like Apex, I would imagine, it has like a little bit of weapon progression in the form of, you know, you pick a gun off the ground and it's just the gun. You have to find a mag, like maybe like some sort of stock or a little sight to put on it or a barrel or whatever. So in in some sense there is still weapon progression. It's just not the way that you would like it. Um yeah, and to be fair, I mean, even if you were to look at something like Call of Duty, the sense of weapon progressions in those games are just so bad. I don't even remember the last Call of Duty I played. Like maybe was it like 2019 or something like that? And in that game, like you had to choose a gun and you had to like level it up like 70 times to unlock an attachment for it. And it's like, bro, this feels like dog shit. You can't even use the gun that you want because it doesn't have the right weapon attachments that you want on it to begin with. And then you have to use it in a shitty state, and then once you finally get the attachments that you want on it, like you don't even want to play the gun anymore, or you're just like, oh, I'm done. I got the max weapon level. Okay, I'm out of here. You know. So I would still say weapon progression is around. It's just, again, it's not in the form that you would like it to be.
In multiplayer, everyone was a clone of one another, no difference in speed or potential health, but the big thing you could have over somebody else was the weapon you found. Getting into the next fight with the right weapon could often be the difference between winning and losing. Movement was simple, and the difference in time to kill from the starting weapons to the more explosive ones was night and day, so a lot of the fights were dictated by who had the bigger gun. Depending on your perspective, that might be a good or a bad quality. What this meant is that every player, regardless of skill level, could experience the thrill of a high-strength scenario just by finding the right weapon. It's hard to say how much of this element contributed to Doom's success, but regardless, it would go on to affect Quake, which would itself go on to inspire almost every single multiplayer FPS at the time.
Yeah.
Unreal, Time Splitters, Halo, all of them had power weapons at their core. With them being in the center, there were shared identifiable traits between titles. These games had a high standard time to kill, with different weapons creating distinct reductions in the length of a firefight. As a result, a lot of the strategy behind a match was how you controlled not the weapon itself, but instead the spawn of weapons, with players who were consistently good being extremely strong at denying players the ability to gain weapons as a resource. Precision was important, but along with that you needed strategy, plans on how to claw your way back to strength once it was lost, and methods to keep your opponent out once you were in. Power weapons, while seemingly quite devoid of nuance when it came to how they distributed strength between players, created a space where being strong required many skills of you. The ability to aim was just the pin that held together ideas of map understanding, player tendencies, and resource control. As a result, a lot of maps, whether intentional or not, were often designed around this element of the game.
So he is 100% true in terms of like an average player, but when I played Halo 1 back in the day, I was a little kid. I had no concept of any of that shit he just said. And so and neither did the adults that I played with, because back in the day, whenever we played Halo, we would just like boot up, like I would bring my Xbox over, do the LAN party thing. We'd have like 3 or 4 like TVs going. Everybody would be like yelling and shit, and we were just like having fun playing the game. We weren't like trying to really strategize anything, because those things didn't really exist. Everybody kind of just had their own little bubble that they were engrossed in. You know, the internet wasn't big as it is today, as it was back then. So the whole strategy aspect, I would say, wasn't really there. So, you know, camping power weapons wasn't really like on the forefront of my mind as a little kid. You know, that like the meta of an FPS game only really reared its naked head years later, when people got more and more access to the internet and they can share strats and so on and so forth.
Lots of corridors and hallways to provide breaks in sightlines and ensure that somebody with the strongest weapon can't just hold a single spot and overlook the whole map at once. That's not to say there weren't maps that went against this, but they were the exception to the rule. Lastly, and likely the least important shared trait, was science fiction. Aside from a couple of outliers like GoldenEye, most titles found themselves within this setting. Maybe this was a way to let the gameplay be arcadey, whatever that means, without being held up against the concept of realism. Chances are, though, this was just a coincidence, a series of inspiration built on inspiration without any deeper purpose to the setting. For almost 10 years, this was the slot that most multiplayer FPS operated under. Ideas of one game leaked into the next, creating an ecosystem that, knowingly or not, had power weapons at the center. As the turn of the century came through, though, the power weapon was fading from the design core of FPS title.
I think one of the reasons power weapons, I guess, started to fade was because people got wise real quick at how powerful and, I don't know, game-changing they were once you got them. They were just really frustrating to play against. I mean, like, even back in the day playing Halo, there would be so many times where my friend's dad would, like, start yelling at his son, like, Connery, stop getting the sniper and sniping me. Stop getting this gun. Stop blasting me with the rocket launcher. So on and so forth. You know, and we even made, like, what do you call it? Like, the shotgun melees back in the day. We just figured that out. It's like, oh, you can shotgun someone, and if you don't kill him, you can follow it up with a melee real quick. You know, if somebody had the shotgun, you don't let them get in close. You know, you can kind of keep them away with grenades and shit. But when somebody had a power weapon, you knew.
In 2004, Counter-Strike's Source's economy weapons would end up swarming the PC market, despite Half-Life 2 Deathmatch releasing the same year. In 2005, Battlefield 2, with an emphasis on vehicles, would get a shot at that spotlight. And who could forget 2007's Call of Duty 4 with loadouts, which ripped Halo from the top spot on consoles.
Oh, yeah.
With each new title being released with power weapons being absent, it was clear something was taking over. And by the 2010s, the power weapon was effectively gone.
It was.
Alright, so that's what happened. But it doesn't really provide any clarity on why.
I think the whole power weapon deletion, it happened when, I would imagine, the esports, like, started popping off. You know, and when people wanted to create a fair environment for people to, just, play FPSs in. You can't really make a fair environment when you have power weapons on, like, just lying there on the map, really. And, I mean, I don't know, like, Halo is still a thing. It's just not as popular, but they still got, power weapons just lying there on the map for the competitive circuit of Halo, to my knowledge. But, I mean, that's just one FPS of many.
Between 2000 and 2010, something had to have happened to push the construct out of these games. Now, as I'm sure you can see, this is a pretty large time span, so it would be ridiculous to say that the erasure of the power weapon was due to any singular product, even if it's tempting to make Call of Duty 4 our scapegoat. While it can often seem like gaming trends rise and fall with one blowout success, even those genre-defining titles have histories that produce its inspiration.
Yeah.
However, even if it's pointless to interrogate any single title, perhaps we should investigate the games that superseded titles like Halo or Quake. Even if they don't hold any answers directly, collectively, they might give us some direction on where it all went astray. Counter-Strike Source.
You know what it kind of feels like so far? It feels like power weapons in FPSs are like playing with items on in Super Smash. That's what it kind of feels like. When you started to delete the power weapons from the shooters, it's like you make every match essentially have, like, no items, the final destination, 3 stocks. That's kind of what it feels like a little bit.
Developed by Valve Software and Turtle Rock Studios, was a sequel to 2000's Counter-Strike, which was itself a retail release of the 1999 mod of the same name. Unlike many of the popular titles at the time, Counter-Strike's pace is decisively slower, The
Oh yeah.
movement more restrictive than most games, the guns more unwieldy than usual, but despite that, it had a universal quality that set itself apart from most games of the time: low time to kill. While FPS at the time
Very
had
speedy.
power weapons that might have given you an effectively instant time to kill, Counter-Strike had this potential in almost every single weapon. It might not have been instant every time, but with one well-placed headshot, it would certainly be a speed you'd remember. This would in fact be a similarity that all three of our suspects shared. In Counter-Strike, the dividing factor for weapon strength wasn't how much damage it did, but instead how it did damage.
Yeah.
The AWP turns the whole chest area into the same strength as a headshot, so despite the extremely low fire rate, it was offset by the size of the target. The high fire rate of the M4 and the AK allowed for more frequent opportunities to get that one shot, and even if you never hit it, just a couple of body shots would be perfectly fine. Shotties might not require the most accuracy, but the rapid damage fall off at a distance meant they weren't versatile enough to find consistent results. These properties clearly delineated some aspect of strength, but nothing compared to the gaps power weapons produced. Perhaps this shuffle towards a faster time to kill was to blame for the power weapon vanishing, but that wasn't the only thing that was changing at the time.
Was it CS that killed the power weapon because of the low time to kill? Oh, that's kind of funny.
Battlefield 2, developed by DICE and published by EA, took a very large departure in how the multiplayer FPS was structured. As opposed to the smaller, tight-knit 2 to 8 person skirmishes that games with power weapons operated under, Battlefield saw fights between 8 people per team, at a minimum. For Halo players who might have been able to dabble with big team battle, that might be nothing new, but when the limit was 64 people per server, it was hard to ignore the scale that Battlefield operated under. A scale matched by its maps, which often dwarfed most games' largest spaces. With such large spaces being a major feature of the title, equally large changes needed to be taken to the convention of the FPS. The game's rules and respawns all revolved around a territory control system, which kept teams close enough together when things were getting dicey, while also providing teams that were ahead some flexibility on how they wanted to navigate the map. You could choose your weapons before you spawned, and much like Counter-Strike, they were separated by the properties of how they did damage rather than how much damage they did. Once again, the time to kill was low. However, here, a distinct power swap occurred. Instead of power being dictated by how quickly you can kill somebody else, strength is decided by how quickly someone else can kill you. Tanks, helicopters, armored vehicles all allowed you to sponge hits while you picked off infantry like they were ants. It was almost the inverse of a power weapon, although not as simple or direct a comparison.
Yeah, it wasn't so much the power weapon, it was the power vehicle. It was more prominent in Battlefield than any other game, I would say.
Thanks to vehicles also providing you with faster movement.
And then, oddly enough, there are a couple Halo titles where Halo tried to adopt this whole power vehicle thing. I mean, to some degree it was successful, but to another degree, if you want to play vehicles, just go play Battlefield. If you want to play Halo, just go play Halo.
The result of these new elements was a game that operated entirely differently. Instead of the focus being shared gameplay that came with searching the map to get power weapons, Battlefield was a game that drifted towards expressive gameplay. The scale of the map, the less direct conflict-oriented goal, and the baseline volatility allowed players to have wildly different experiences and approaches to how they behaved throughout a match. Perhaps after years of the power weapon dictating a predictable and familiar pace, this was a breath of fresh air that soured people's taste for the norm. That's of course only speculation, especially since what was coming next would, maybe surprisingly, resemble what people were already acquainted with. Call of Duty 4 was developed by Infinity Ward and published by Activision, but I'm sure you already knew that. In the public eye, it's infamous for changing the gaming market for years to come, but let's not get too ahead of ourselves. After 3 installments in this
changing the market, not its prices, even 15 years later.
Franchise under a World War II aesthetic, Modern Warfare would shift to being, well, modern aesthetics, modern weapons, and what was starting to become a modern time to kill. However, outside of that, this fourth installment was surprisingly traditional in certain aspects.
I mean, the whole modern time to kill thing, that's like the COD time to kill was like in between instant, which was CS, and long as fuck, which, I would say would have been Halo or something. COD was like somewhere in the middle, at least this one.
While there was a lot of different game modes, team deathmatch and free-for-alls of 8 people were most of the rage. Maps are tightly connected webs of hallways, designed more similarly to maps of old. The scale and scope of the multiplayer, while definitely not the same as the games of old, was more a progression of what previously existed rather than the dramatic departure of the other two titles. That said, even with that similarity, the time to kill would once again change how weapons were acquired and leave power weapons as a concept that was off the table.
So, in some sense, it was like, what was it? Like your account level dictated what weapons you had available to you at the time. So, and you had like your ranked and your like little prestige ranks or whatever in that COD. What was it, like level 1 to, was it 100? It was like a normal prestige, progression. Some of the, if you were to like look at the guns, it would be like, oh, you need to be level 36 to unlock this gun. You need to be level 40 whatever to unlock that gun. And it was just simply a matter of putting in the time to play the game to unlock the weapon. That's all it was. And what's funny is that what was it? If you were to like jump into a multiplayer match as like a low level person, and this was back when SBMM wasn't a thing, it would throw you in a match with like some whatever levels. They could be like prestige 55 zillion or like level 10 or whatever. It didn't really matter. If you killed that like prestige guy, he would just drop his gun on the ground and all of a sudden you can just walk over and pick up his weapon that he had if you didn't feel like using your gun. So that's also a thing.
Call of Duty, while recognizing the lack of room for power to be given to the player through weapons, provided strength through kill streaks. An eye in the sky to tell you where players were, airstrikes to find kills in corners you couldn't see, and the big one, a helicopter to act as your wingman. This all culminated in a game that was volatile and fast-paced. The highs stayed high, and the lows were just a blip. And for lots of people, that made Call of Duty moreish, hard to put down. And for many, delightfully addictive.
Oh yeah, having to drop the nuke. Because what was it? Most of the time, it was like, there were like a bunch of different styles of kill streaks, but the main one to get a nuke was like, nuke was on the last one, then it was like chopper gunner or AC-130, and then once you had, the thing that started it was like getting 7 kills to get the Harrier. It came with a Predator. It was like a Predator and it followed up with a Harrier. So it was like Harrier, attack chopper, or AC-130 into the nuke. That was the thing. And the hardest part was always getting the first 7 to unlock the Harrier.
Zooming our perspective out, there's some pretty clear connections between each of these games that, to one extent or another, doesn't so much as exclude power weapons, but instead makes them redundant. It's not that any of these games set out to get rid of the concept, it's that linking elements of design didn't give power weapons a place. The weakest link between all of these games being how they were, for the most part, radical departures in FPS structure. I call it a weak link because how these games changed structure was so different from one another, combined with other shared changes, that it's hard to say it had any effect on the power weapon's place in their games. Even Battlefield 2, when it's at its smallest, has some structural similarities to Halo at its largest, but only one of those kept going forward with power weapons. If we were to draw any conclusion though, it might be that people were getting tired of the type of gameplay structure that power weapons created.
So the whole thing with the concept of a power weapon is like, in Halo, the main guns that you start off with, I think, are or if you do like multiplayer and you don't like customize anything, the main gun is like the assault rifle. And if you just use the assault rifle, the time to kill on it is like very long. It, but you know, unlike the assault rifle, you also had the pistol, which was like just insanely good at the time. But I mean, you know, you could easily argue that the pistol is a power weapon in and of itself, but you know, just for the sake of the argument, we'll say like the AR is like the base gun that you use. And I think with Quake, the main gun that you start with is it's like some machine gun or some shit. It's like, I mean, yeah, it's hit scan or whatever, but it doesn't deal the same damage as like the lightning gun or the rail gun or the rocket launcher. So just going off of that, like you have like two guns that as like a foundation, they just suck. It's, you know, they create this long time to kill scenario unless you pick up a power weapon like the sniper, the rocket launcher, the shotgun. Likewise, in Quake, you have the lightning gun, the rail gun, the rocket launcher. So the concept of a power weapon is just basically creating a long time to kill instance into a seemingly almost instant, uh, you know, time to kill instance. And what a lot of the games did that you mentioned is they literally just took that aspect out of it and made it so that anybody can kill anybody at any time. You know, with Call of Duty with the kill streaks, Battlefield with the vehicles, and what was it? The other game you mentioned, it was something else.
which would lend reason to why all of these games were successful in different ways. Another connection would be a move towards a greater degree of player choice. With each of these games letting you pick and choose your loadout, to an extent, players had the opportunity to break free of the somewhat rigid choices that games involving power weapons had. That's not to say that a game like Quake or Halo didn't have player expression, more so that that expression was nuanced and not as distinctive. With players being able to pick loadouts, it makes sense that power weapons would be a non-option. Even excluding the idea that you could just pick the most powerful weapon from the start,
Oh yeah.
they might have diminished the value a player had in their choice of loadout by always subtracting it for the statistically better option when they find it. That might be the reason that Halo Reach, which had match-specific loadouts and power weapons, often saw identical setups for guns with a choice of armor abilities, none of which could be swapped out in conventional game modes. That said, I don't think a more hands-on ability for the player to express themselves was the culprit either. While power weapons weren't present, these games still had power structures, where the strength of the player is determined by properties of the game rather than the player's ability. In Years of Old, power weapons were power structures, but here that's presented through properties, vehicles, and kill streaks. If we allude that player expression is reduced by the existence of power structures, then it would make sense why power weapons stopped existing, but it wouldn't explain why these games still had power structures. It's what caused these power structures to morph that I think is the strongest link between all of these games. Time to kill. With the average TTK getting lower and lower, power weapons just didn't have the room to fulfill that adjective in the noun.
That's actually a pretty fair assessment, to be honest. Since a lot of these games just had weapons in them that made time to kill so low, you didn't need power weapons in them to create that instance of, you know, just instantly killing someone when you can play Call of Duty and just level up a bunch and then just pick like an intervention or a Bear 50 cal or whatever, because a lot of the guns just instantly kill each other. Or, you know, as far as like player v player goes, you know, it wasn't in the instance of Halo, two players like charging from like really far distances with machine guns and just slowly coming closer, and then even that like 2 or 3 seconds amount of time wasn't long enough to, you know, get you a kill or whatever.
Their identity comes from the vast leap in strength over other options, but without intentionally weak weapons, that identity begins to dissipate. That in turn forced power structures to make changes, which in this circumstance inevitably killed off the power weapon. However, if we assume all that to be true, the time to kill likely didn't commit murder. It would have been manslaughter, because the reduction in time to kill is also an entwined byproduct of the shifting market of games.
Oh?
Between the 1990s and the 2000s, a lot of games found themselves set within the realm of high fantasy or science fiction. One of the reasons for that would be the ripples of nerd culture in the 60s and 70s, with Star Trek, Star Wars, and Alien influencing the interests of people who were able to make games at the time, and another would be the limitations of technology. Graphics hardware was limited, and so in order to wow audiences, you had to take a lot of creative liberties in what you were portraying. Something quite hard if you're trying to convince someone of reality, but if you're saying it's thoroughly fictional, it allows for spectacle in the absence of high fidelity. This isn't just limited to the FPS. Racing games also dive into sci-fi more frequently in this era, and in both genres you can see examples where the abstraction of the setting also brings systems of fantasy, gravity-defying cars, and guns that are basically pea shooters thanks to fictional armor. It's hard to say if the aesthetics influenced the mechanics or vice versa, but it's likely that they were intertwined in some regard. 90s racing games that played their cards close to aesthetic reality also attempted to reflect reality in the systems, even if technology left them with handling models that we'd now recognize as arcadey. In that science fiction setting, power weapons made perfect sense, both aesthetically and functionally. But once the 2000s hit, commercially available hardware was making leaps and bounds forward. As a result, graphical direction that resembled real life was not only feasible, but also a great way to show off to an audience and leave a positive impression. In both genres, this led to games where the visual fidelity leaned towards realism, but improvements in visuals alone didn't encourage gameplay changes.
So, what are you hinting at? The more realistic the game started looking, the more realistic the effect of a bullet going into a person was also supposed to be more realistic. So you could like empty like 5 or 6 bullets into someone and expect to get a kill. Something like in Call of Duty. I mean, I don't know, maybe. Like hardware and graphics. I mean, that kind of follows.
Look at a title like Gears of War. Although it's a game where the visual fidelity aims at realism, the other science fiction elements still allow for power weapons to fit in the aesthetic. That's the problem though. Around the time hardware started to improve, science fiction was slowly bleeding out. Popular aesthetics was shifting away from future fantasy and towards military fiction. There might be a reason for this. Maybe something that happened in 2001 in New York. It involved a plane. 2 actually. It's a mystery, I guess. Regardless, if the amount of active US military participants is anything to go by, there was an uptick in Western patriotism and nationalism after 2001, and subsequently in 2003 with the US.
Bro, I never would have put that together. Like, I would have really loved to have realized the cultural impact after the whole 9/11 thing of video games against just the US market, especially like the milsim ones, you know, like, I mean, not necessarily like milsim, but like, you know, Call of Duty, what was that other one? Not Black Ops, Spec Ops, what was it? It was like some other one where you were like Navy SEALs or some shit. But there was like a good chunk of like realistic, you know, military shooters that were just popping out and people just loved them.
And UK invasion of Iraq after several years of rapidly declining people in service. Using this as an indicator, wartime efforts were more likely in the cultural consciousness. In some cases, that's reflected in the media produced. Films like The Hurt Locker, which seems to want to tell an anti-war story with arguable success, or Rise Against's Hero of War, the least subtle anti-war song that, if the YouTube comments are anything to go by, was painfully misinterpreted as a pro-military and nationalist battle theme. This cultural shift in attention has some reflections in almost all Western media, but the fervor around graphical realism set the stage for games to be acutely vulnerable to this shift. Even prior to the painful flood that Modern Warfare would incite, wartime narrative, especially around World War II, was on the rise thanks to games like Medal of Honor, Company of Heroes, Day of Defeat, and once again, Call of Duty. As these games got closer to reality, it would only make sense that they move away from science fiction aesthetics as well as mechanics. This meant less vertical combat spaces, no massive health pools, and just as importantly, no power weapons.
No power weapons. No power weapons in real life. So we're not gonna have power weapons in our game. That's bullshit.
I want to say that's where the case ends. We found our man. But in reality, there's still too many loose threads to land on any solid conclusion. Around 2016, science fiction in games was back on the rise, but power weapons were nowhere to be seen. Instead, a new power structure of temporary massive bursts in power through ultimates was on the rise with the likes of Overwatch, and to a lesser extent, Titanfall. So although the aesthetic concept had returned, its systems were different. That's also ignoring games that did attempt to bring a revival to power weapons, like Quake Champions, Toxic, or Splitgate, but only saw an incredibly niche fanfare. Although our three suspects create a neat set of similarities, could games like Team Fortress 2 in 2007 or Brink in 2011 cut the links we observed and reveal causation as merely correlation? What if red guns in Apex or gold weapons in Fortnite are the evolution of the power weapon? What if the power weapon was showing signs of illness before the 2000s, and their disappearance is through more natural causes? Unfortunately,
I mean, even in Apex, they're you got the care pack weapons, but even then, like, the Kraber has been nerfed. Like, you can no longer get like a headshot really and like kill somebody unless they have like just blue armor or whatever. So even the concept of pyro weapons in some of these games is just slowly just melting away, it seems. So
with the infinite sprawl of the games industry, along with everything that might impact it, those questions will remain a mystery. The only thing that's certain is that here and now, the power weapon is still missing.
Yep. And something else is that the power weapon represents something that is random. And for the case of esports and ranked in whatever your favorite FPS is, random is good for fun, but it's not good for fairness. And if you ask one person what do they value more, funness or fairness, you're going to get a different answer than if you were to ask that question to someone else and all they do is like play ranked all day for their favorite game. So I don't know, that's just another question or whatever. The power weapon, it's like I said before, it's like like playing with items on in Super Smash. Sometimes you do play with it on, sometimes you play with it off. It just depends.
Howdy. Just want to come through at the end of the video and say thank you for watching. I'm sorry that this video took ages again, but I now have a Patreon. I mean, I've had it for like 6 months, but everything on it is free. It's mostly write-ups about the creative process, but if you want to support the videos, and I mean, I guess it really is just supporting the videos, then you can do that over there. Okay, I don't want to waste too much of your time. Bye-bye.
Nice. No, I'm a fan. I thought this is a great-ass video, dude. I want to see more, honestly. But, I mean, the whole concept of of the power weapon. I mean, the power weapon represents randomness and luck, and depending on who your audience is, like they're either gonna love it or they're gonna hate it. So I don't know. I still say keep power weapons in games, but just give the player the option whether or not to play with them or not. And every game title has their own version of it. To acquire it. In Call of Duty, if you play long enough, you unlock the attachments or you unlock the guns. Apex, the care pack weapons. Call of Duty, what is it? They still have kill streaks. So I don't know. It was a good video though, definitely, and I want to see more like this. So yeah. But I'll catch you guys on the next one. All right, later.